I'd like to go ahead and welcome our presenter tonight. We have with us Jennifer Horne. So Jennifer is the Poet Laureate of Alabama, the author of three collections of poems titled Bottle Tree, Little Wanderer, and Borrowed Life. She is also a collection of short stories, Tell the World You're a Wildflower, and she has edited or co-edited 4 volumes of poetry, essays, and stories. Her latest work is a biography of the writer Sarah Mayfield. And then her webpage and blog, A Map of the World, are at jennifer-horne.blogspot.com. So we'll drop that in the chat for you as well to go visit if you'd like. That being said, welcome, Jen. Thank you for coming out tonight. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Haley. I am glad to see y'all's faces and screens, and just want to thank you for being here. I'm glad to be a part of the Spark Festival. My plan is to make this more of a informal craft talk instead of a formal presentation. So I'm going to take us through some of the steps of critiquing a poem. Mostly this is thinking about how we critique others' poems, but anything that I say can be applied to self-critique. So that if you're looking at your own poem and you just need some tools, you can just use these to critique your own work, sort of put on your editor hat. I know we probably have some varying levels of experience with critiquing poems, so I'll try to check in as we go along to see if I need to explain more of something or go more in depth about something that you already are familiar with. You can throw questions in the chat, and Haley and Rachel are going to help with that. So just feel free to do that. Or since we're a small group, raise your actual or virtual hand, and I can get to you that way as well. You can unmute. How many people present have been involved in some kind of group critique, whether a critique group or a workshop? How many of y'all have done that? All right, good, okay. And I too have been involved in a lot of workshops. One critique group, and then I also have a couple of buddies that I bounce things off of, sort of trusted readers. How many of you regularly exchange poems with somebody for critique that same way? Yeah, a couple of us. Okay, all right, good. That can also be really helpful once you find somebody who kind of gets your work. That can be helpful. And has anybody been involved in setting up a critique group, sort of as the organizer of it? Okay, all right. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end as well. So this is going to be a how-to essay in that sense. But before I get to how, I want to talk a little bit about why. Everybody who's involved in the Spark Festival, I think I can say, is here because you want to be a better writer. You're figuring out ways to improve your writing, and part of that is finding writing community. So when we think about improving our writing, we think about how do I make a particular individual work that I've created better. I like to think about it as both me and not me, something that I've written. Comes from me, it's my creation, but it also needs to sort of stand on its own 2 feet apart from me. And so in critiques, I think it's helpful to get that little bit of distance and say, this is not all me. This is a thing that I've made, and I want to let it be the best made thing that it can be. In critiquing, I think it's always important to respect other people's aesthetics. They may not have the same sense of what a poem should be that you do, but you can meet them on their terms and see what their poem is trying to be. Even before the why of critiquing, maybe we could get to the whether of critiquing. And I want to flag some things that maybe you should not do in terms of critiquing poems. It's usually not a good idea to ask a family member to respond to your work. We've all done it, but you probably are not going to get the exact response that you want. And for heaven's sakes, especially if it's about the family member, unless it's a love poem, then probably not. So I would say, let your family members off the hook. Find another writer to bounce things off. When you've just finished a poem and are still deeply in love with it, and you don't want to hear a bad word against it, and in fact, you would really like to be told it was the best poem ever written. Again, probably not the best time to put it up for critique. If any of your poems are in that lockdown stage, where you really think they're pretty much done, then you're sort of wasting other people's if you say, ask for suggestions, because you're probably not going to take them. And then the other time I would say not to show a poem to somebody is something that happened to me. I had a visiting writer to our house for dinner and invited another writer, and something about that evening really made that writer angry, and he wrote a really kind of scathing poem about the evening. It was very insulting, and then he showed it to me and was surprised when I wasn't very happy. So if the poem is about somebody and it's not positive, I'd say also do not share the poem. He said, "Don't you know where poems come from?" And I said, "Well, yes, but really." So on to talking about critiquing and how we do it. For me, the key question is not, is this the perfect poem, or is this a wonderful poem, but a real functional way of looking at things, which is, what is this poem trying to do and how well is it doing it? Not what do you want this poem to be doing. So what is this poem trying to do? What's its goal in life? Does it want to be, if you use a building metaphor, does it want to be a skyscraper or a garden shed, or a suburban house? What does this poem want to be? And then, given that you sort of assess that, how well is it doing that? And that means reading with respect, commenting with kindness, not necessarily being so nice that you can't say anything negative, but sort of keeping in mind the golden rule. Don't say anything to somebody that you wouldn't be okay with having said to yourself. To talk about beginnings, whenever I visit a workshop that I'm not usually a part of, like if I come in as a visiting writer, I ask the participants to keep in mind that I don't know their work. I don't know the body of their work. I don't know the bigger projects that they might be working on. So, I will be commenting on what I see in front of me, but to consider that I don't know them and I don't know the what they're working with. And so if I say something that just doesn't make sense, that's okay. They can just take that with a grain of salt and move on. I also try to say that I like to take the poem in terms of responding. Like, I read this poem and here's how I respond to it. So I'm not passing judgment. I'm not saying this is a good poem or a bad poem, weighing it in my right and left hands. I'm saying this poem makes me think of, or when I read this line, it makes me wonder about, or I really liked this line because, or I didn't quite understand this line because. So just in a sort of, here are the responses that are coming up in me. So like a non-judgmental approach, I think, is really helpful in any kind of critique situation. One thing I also really like is to think of a critique group or a workshop as a laboratory for experiments. So we're just in here, we're experimenting with words, we're experimenting with poems. And so you can think about, well, what if I take this and combine them as in a lab? What if I put these things under pressure? What happens? What if I put these two very disparate things together? Will they explode? Maybe in a good way. Just think of the critique situation as a laboratory experiment. And you could even dissect it and see what happens. And y'all can tell me if this is something that you've done. Some workshops find it helpful to speak about if there's an I voice in the poem, to talk about the speaker instead of saying, you, Haley, how you express yourself in this poem. Has anybody done that in a workshop where they talked about the speaker in this poem instead of you? Couple of people. All right. That's something that I think, again, talking about that distance where the poem both is and isn't you, that's a way to create a little critical distance where since I know Lori just a little bit, I'd say, like Lori has a first person poem that we're critiquing, and I say, boy, the speaker in this poem seems to not, Lori, I didn't know you, da 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 da. So it's just a rhetorical device for creating that little bit of distance. And for the writer, again, going back to that lab metaphor, this is an experiment. This is a lab. This is a tool for gathering information. Might be useful, might not be. You take it in, and then when you get back to your writing desk, you go, okay, I like this, I don't like this. Maybe this is something I can work with, but you're just gathering information. Again, neutral, non-judgmental, not a comment on you or your soul or your poetry. Just take it in and see what you can do with it. Finally, I would say it never hurts to start off with, here's what I like about this poem, just like find a good thing. And if you're a teacher, and I think several of the people in this meeting are, start off with something positive. Boy, that image just knocked my socks off. And then go from there. Find something positive. So let's get into the nitty gritty a little bit of looking at poems. I'm sure everybody has had either an English class or a lot of English classes along the way where you talked about the elements of poetry. And I find those can be pretty useful in just getting to know a poem. I think of my first approach to a poem is the getting to know you stage. Walk around the elephant, look at all the different parts and see what you've got there. So imagery is one of the main drivers of a poem. So sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. What images are there? What are the sensory images that show up? Beyond that, it can also be helpful to see if the images hold together in some kind of family. Like, are they all water related images? Are they all nature related? Are they domestic images? Sometimes images will coalesce around a theme or family. How does the poem sound? That's another really important part. Who's the speaker? Can you tell? And whether there's a identified speaker or not, what's the tone of the poem? Is it jubilant or cynical or nihilistic, celebratory? Can you name some kind of general tone? Form, obviously, is another really important element in poetry. It might be formal verse, like a sonnet, villanelle, a haiku. It might be an invented form that somebody has just come up with, and it's always fun to make up your own form. Or it might be what we generally call free verse, without a particular set rhyme or rhythm pattern. Is there a subject to this poem? Is it about visiting my grandmother? Is it about summer camp? Is it about depression? Can you see if the poem that you're critiquing has a subject? That's another way to get to know it. Is there a setting? Does it take place, again, on a farm? And does it allude to anything? Maybe it makes an allusion to King Lear, say, something Shakespearean. So the imagery, the sounds of the poem, how it actually sounds in your mouth, in your ear, the speaker, the tone, the form that it takes, the subject of the poem, if there is an identifiable subject, the setting, if there's a setting, and any allusions it makes. Those are all ways to just kind of walk around the poem and get to know it. Even the most dense, abstract poems that I read, I can still get my little toolbox out, and I can say, okay, I can find this, I can find this, I can find this, and that gives me something to work with. And that brings me to why it's really important to read a lot of poetry, from as far back as you can go, from as many cultures as you can find in translation, different kinds of forms. I mean, I've been in workshops where people say, oh, well, I don't read that. I don't read that kind of poem. I don't read this. And I just think, you don't have to like it. You just have to know about it. Because if you're a good reader, you're going to have a lot more tools in your toolbox as a writer. And you're also going to be able to be a much better critiquer. If somebody has written a 14-line poem and you don't know that it might be a sonnet, you're not probably going to be all that helpful to them in critiquing their sonnet. So the more you can bring to a critique setting in terms of just your general familiarity with different kinds of poetry, that's going to be real helpful. That is, of course, also true for self-critiquing. The more you know, if you have a poem that seems to be falling between 13 and 15 lines, you might say, this might be something that would work itself into a sonnet, or maybe an unrhymed kind of sonnet-ish kind of poem, so that you're familiar with the tradition that you're working with. Back when I was in college, I was lucky enough, my college brought Denise Levertov, the poet, to Hendrix College in Arkansas. I don't know why she agreed to come, but she did. And she taught a poetry workshop it was my first poetry workshop that I was ever in. And I had written this poem about a piece of paper that was just tumbling across the street and how sad it was. And I had made it very much sort of anthropomorphized the piece of paper, that it was tragically lost and tumbling. And Denise Levertov gave me this William Carlos Williams poem and said, here, look at this. And it was a poem about a piece of paper tumbling across the street that did not anthropomorphize the piece of paper. And it was, of course, way better than mine. But it taught me something just by looking at, oh, that's how you might approach that subject. So these things can be invaluable. It just the background that you bring to other people's poems and critiquing them into your own. I feel like I just gave a mini sermon, but anyway, I'll stop with that subject. Moving on deeper, after you sort of walked around and kicked the tires, I think that there is an element of critique that involves intuition, that just you kind of feel your way into the poem, and that may have to do with the subject and the general feel, but also in the sense of like a poem being like a piece of sculpture. Is it the shape it wants to be? Are there some parts that are still kind of rough and not formed yet? Is there a big old chunk over here that just is not working with the whole? So an intuitive feel of what the poem wants to be, and I really do think poems have their own minds, when they want to be poems. And what does it want to be? So intuitively, what's the feel? One of the most important things I learned in my writing classes was to kind of look for a hot spot in a poem. And I say hot spot, it might feel like kind of a magnet or something with a little electrical charge. There's often a place in a poem that's the heart of the poem. Sometimes it will tell you, oh, this is like where I'm avoiding something difficult, like you keep coming back to it and it's not quite right. And it's like, I just got to go ahead and get in there, and deal with that in the poem. But that's another intuitive thing, is just sort of feel your way towards where it's warm, where it's magnetized, where there's an electrical charge. Just feel your way into that. And also, I try to feel where there's some kind of sense of tension and energy in the poem, something that is energy in the lines, attention that's being explored, that the poem will, at least in its poetic moment, resolve, not for all time, but within the poem. So I feel for a kind of tension and energy, and that can come through all of those things I've talked about, the imagery and sound and form and so on. But it's also a conceptual thing, what's being wrestled with in this poem. most poems that don't have something that's being wrestled with at least a little bit often are not very interesting. So it's just, it is a beautiful day. Everything is going well. That tends not to provoke us to write poems. So think about that if there's some kind of tension. And then finally, these are just some I don't know, further tools, further considerations. These are some little tricks that I've figured out over time that sometimes can be helpful when working on your own poems as a self-critique or with critiquing other people's poems. How many of you have figured out at one point or another that the first part of the poem is really just kind of getting you in there? Yeah, and then like those lines, they could just go. They really were not that important, but you needed them. There's a great line in Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus. He says that this was all just like a ladder, and I can push the ladder away now that I've climbed up. So those first lines are often, I think of that as the ladder that gets you there, but then you can get rid of it. Sometimes you can move the end to the beginning. Like the end is interesting, and you can use it as a beginning to get your poem started. And by some kind of quirk of poem psychology, that often works because you got yourself to where you needed to get, and then you can get the reader at that point as well. I like to, after I've worked on the poem for a bit, look at stanzas and see if they're moving towards some kind of regularity. And I've taken that into my critiquing as well. Like if I see a poem that the stanzas, are kind of falling into loose groups, you can often suggest to somebody, why don't you take a look at that? Titles are tricky. Yeah, can I get an amen on that? And so as a critique, as somebody critiquing another person's poem, you can be very helpful to them in saying, this title is okay, but maybe it could do some more work, and maybe you can help brainstorm about that. I look for abstractions in a poem, hope, love, despair. Those sometimes are a little, they're lazy writing, and so you can help somebody say, well, what would be an image that conveyed hope, or what would be an image that conveyed despair? You can also look for adjectives. Just go through a poem that you're reading to critique and see if the adjectives are doing their work, or if they're predictable, a dark sky, a happy child. And then sometimes you can, you might not suggest these to the person whose poem you're critiquing, but just say, could you push that? Could you come up with a less predictable adjective, not the one that not a busy bee, but a crazy bee? I mean, just take it and tweak it and play with it. And that's something you can do with your own work too. If somebody has written a sonnet, look at the rhymes. I know sometimes when I write in form, I'll look at a line and I'll say, oh, that I just did that rhyme because I could make it fit, but it seems sort of jammed in there, like working a jigsaw puzzle, and you just want to make it stick in there, but it won't. Look for whether the rhymes seem natural or not, and pay attention to that. You also might be able to point out places that an internal rhyme or a slant rhyme, like if you're reading somebody's poems and you say, oh, this rhymes with this inside the line, maybe we could do another one of those and then another one and set up a pattern. So even if you're not writing formal n-rhymed poems, you might be able to say, like, oh, let's see, in the second line there's the word bent, and then down here in the fourth line there's the word lent in the middle of the line, and then maybe we could figure out another int word that would still fit in the poem and just create some kind of sound continuity there. So that's something that you can help in pointing out. One thing that can be useful to suggest is changing the voice. If it's in first person, change it to third person. We often talk about that in fiction, but it can be an equally helpful suggestion in poetry. And then pay attention to line breaks. I think I could spend the rest of my life working on lines and line breaks. I'm always learning something new. And if you see a place where a line breaks and is confusing, that's really helpful to point out. Or if you see that a line could be just broken better to make either a better line or a better break, that can also be helpful to point out. And I will go back through these in a few minutes. We're going to do a sample critique poem and just kind of play with some of these things that we've been talking about and give you a little practice. The last big thing, which I have saved to the end to talk about, is meaning. And sometimes that's something people want to jump right in and say, oh, this is what this poem is about. This is what this poem means. But I find it's a lot more helpful to approach it through the elements of poetry and then those other considerations as a way of getting to know it and sort of creeping up on poem, on the poem's meaning. The tell the truth, but tell it slant is Emily Dickinson's favorite line. Because truth is told slant in a poem, you kind of have to sneak up on it. And I think if you just jump right in a workshop or a critique group and start saying, what does this mean? You're going to miss a lot of the other things that will be helpful to the poet in making their poem better. So a way to sneak up on meaning might be to say, this poem seems to me to be about separation and loss. That's what I'm getting from this poem. I wonder what kind of images might convey separation and loss. So, just sitting here right now, you can think, what's a physical image that conveys separation? A child being lost in a department store from her mother, that gives you that very quickly. And so that can sometimes be helpful if you are getting a certain feel or set of ideas from a poem. You can convey that to the person whose poem you're reading and ask them to think about, what images might reinforce that. One last thing, sometimes when you're in a workshop or a group and at the end, maybe the poet says, oh, well, to me, this was about da 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 da, and everybody else looks blank. It may suggest that the poem is not doing what it needs to be doing in order to convey that. A poem is a personal expression. It's also a communication. If you want your poems to communicate something to people, and you find that the other 9 people in your group of 10 say, I just did not get that at all, you might need to go back to the drawing board. It might be that the poem is not achieving what it is that you had hoped it would achieve. So just something to keep in mind. You don't have to, but it's something to keep in mind. So I thought we might take a little time, and I'm going to share my screen and look at poem. All righty. So I'm assuming everybody can see this. All right. This is a sample poem that I wrote just for the purposes of practicing critiquing. It seems like in the last year, I have watched a lot of British mystery series, a lot of detective shows, and many of them center around a deep, dark secret in somebody's past, like 20 years ago. And so I was sort of in that mindset, and I wrote a poem out of that mindset just for fun. So I'm going to read it. And in the column to the right, I've put down the elements of poetry and further considerations. that I talked about. I'm going to try to let's see, expand a little bit. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to see everybody, but I should be able to see most of you. The poem I wrote, "Going Home," was the title I gave it, and I'll just read through it. And as I read through it, think about some of the things in the right-hand column, and then we can talk about that. Going home. I was driving the long road home when I began thinking about the last time I'd been there. Hawk sitting on a fence post. What do you have to tell me about survival? Do ghosts of field mice disturb your sleep, or do you, predator, enjoy sweet dreams? If I were a little field mouse in a little field house, would I grouse and want to get soused if you ate my neighbor? My worn birder's guide tells me how to identify each bird in flight, but how to know which creature I identify with, predator or prey, bully or victim. I'm returning to the scene of the crime, the primal scene, the place that rhymes with its original, was it sadness, gladness, madness? Its original something. It's timed out now. I wanted to forget, and so I did. So that was just me playing around with several different things that I thought might be interesting to talk about. And let's see, excuse me just a sec. There we go. I'm trying to get everybody in my screen so that I can respond to you. That's pretty good. Yeah. Will that work for you guys? Can you see enough of the poem and the considerations? Okay. So anybody want to unmute and just make a assessing comment about something that you see going on in this poem? Is there a speaker? I would say there's an I, so there's a first person speaker. It's a person who knows some things about birds, at least a little bit. They know about hawks and field mice, and they have a birder's guide. So I could say that about the speaker. They tell us that they're driving home, wherever home might be.
Right. I would even wager to say that the title could be strengthened by placing us even further into place. So instead of the first line being, I was driving the long road home, even driving the long road home could be the title, or even taking a line from further down, the returning to the scene of the crime, or returning the long road home, something that's got a stronger verb than maybe just driving.
Yes. And thanks, Haley. And I should say, my feelings are not on the line here. I really wrote this poem just to be critiqued. So have at it. I hope that it would have some things in it that would give us material to critique. So don't think of this as written by me. Think of this as just a sample critique poem. What do y'all think about the first lines? Do we need to keep them or not?
No, get rid of them.
Okay.
Particularly if you take Haley's suggestion and change the title, like The Long Road Home or something else, then just start out with the direct address hawk sitting on the fence post.
Yeah, I like hawk sitting on a fence post. It's a lot stronger beginning, isn't it? It dresses the hawk. It gives us an image. And the first three lines are kind of like do, kind of getting us into the poem. It gives us some subject information, but like Haley said, that could be covered in the title. And Michael, I see you have a hand up. Hey, Michael, are you there? Okay, we'll come back to you if you have something to ask. All right. What about tone? Could you describe like what the general tone of this is, or if it's inconsistent in tone in any way? Like, does it seem, okay, yes, Susan, yeah.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of if I were a little field mouse in my house and grouse. The tone certainly we'll say modulates.
Right, so there's a shift there, right? Yeah, there's a shift. Um, and partly the kind of sing-songy rhymes, mouse, house, grouse, souse, creates that. Partly the little, partly just the idea of getting soused. All of that creates a much more playful tone than throughout the rest of the poem. So if we were critiquing this in a group, we might say, it's an interesting stanza, but it doesn't necessarily fit with the rest of the poem. Could it be changed or maybe just deleted, depending. You might want to keep in the predator and prey idea, but you've got that in the first stanza. So maybe that second stanza was just playful drafting and could go.
Well, couldn't you also suggest that that second stanza might be its own poem at a later date?
Absolutely, that's a great idea. Thank you for mentioning that, because I mean, I have a stack of things that I've saved because I couldn't bear to get rid of them, and sometimes those bits and pieces actually do become other poems. That can be quite helpful. Thank you.
So Michael has raised the question, driving home from where, and says that it reminded him of Robert Frost, whose woods are these? And then Bonnie has also mentioned, is the speaker tired and not wanting to address the memory?
Ah, that's a good intuitive comment. Yeah. Is the speaker avoiding addressing whatever that primal scene is? Yes, I love that intuitive comment.
I would also probably jump in and say, so when we're talking about the Warren Birders Guide, my Warren Birders Guide, instead of saying that the guide is worn, maybe focusing in on an image of the guide itself to let the reader know that it's worn. So maybe the way the page's edges happen to look, or the split in the spine, or something like that.
Love that. Yeah, just saying it's worn doesn't give us the visual image of that, but we could come up with some really good visual worn images like you just did. I love that. We talked about the rhymes mouse, house, grouse, souse. How about sadness, gladness, madness as rhymes? That's another sound element. And again, in a workshop group, it's like, does that work for you or not? It's going to be different for different people. Like this speaker is kind of confused about that primal scene, I think, to the point that they've repressed it. Was it sadness, gladness, madness? I don't know. I forgot. I wanted to forget. Tried to repress it. Psychologically, do you want to go into why this person is going home if it is a scene of the crime that's confusing to them? Does it make you question that? I'm curious about it. I wrote it sort of in another voice, but then of course it's always to some degree your own voice. I'm curious about what it is that this person has repressed and yet is drawn back to.
Bonnie says it seems the speaker starts to pull up the memory, but then is exasperated and doesn't want to continue in the memory.
And is that frustrating to you as a reader?
Personally, I find a little bit of frustration. Bonnie says it makes me want to see more. And I myself say that, so we've got the stanza where the speaker questions themselves, if I were a little field mouse, but then in the next stanza, they're trying to identify how to know which creature I identify with, predator or prey, bully or victim. But we don't really see them trying to identify with predator. We see them diving only into if I were the prey, not also if I were the predator. So not considering the personal ramifications of what would it be like if I were the predator.
Yeah. And this brings up, I wanted to bring up this question, because sometimes when you're looking at a poem, I would say sometimes when I'm looking at a poem, somebody else's poem, I do feel a sense of frustration. It's like maybe holding out on me a little bit. That not that I have to know everything down to the last detail, but I don't want it to seem withholding. I don't want it to be holding back in some way. And it almost feels like this poem kind of creeps up to, but then doesn't go ahead and face whatever this thing is. And sometimes when that happens, another thing you can ask is, does this poem need to push farther? Does it need to have more? Do we just, and sometimes the suggestion can be made, just keep writing and see what you get after you think you're done with the poem. And sometimes that some of the best stuff, comes out then.
Michael says, memory as demons, let sleeping dogs sleep. Bonnie says, yes, looking at the point of view of predator as well could show more about the memory and the speaker's frame of mind and perspective without explicitly stating it.
Cool, well put. Thank you both. Susan, do you have your hand up? No, okay, all right, just checking, all right.
No, I was thinking though, since you called, if we were to take out the field mouse stanza, it is much tighter to go from whether you're disturbed by ghosts of the field mouse that you've eaten, Mr. Hawk or Mrs. Hawk or Hawk, to which creature would I be? In other words, there is a connection there. If you take that other stanza out, it makes it tighter.
Yes.
But I identify with predator or prey, bully or victim. I would say survivor or victim, or something else rather than bully.
Mm-hmm. So the predator,
something that is more predator-like.
Yes.
Win or
predator
loser.
And survivor, those are kind of nice parallel sounds as well. So right. I like that, the auditory aspect of that. So say you took away the first 3 lines of the poem, and then you have that's 6 lines following it. Then the second stanza is 6 lines, but we might decide to get rid of that. And then the third stanza is 6 lines. And then the fourth is 7 lines. It seems to be falling into a pretty regular pattern as free verse. So it might be worth it to try to make that last stanza a little tighter and be a 6-line stanza. And do you see anything that's flabby there? Any words you'd cut out if you wanted to make it into a 6-line stanza? Alternately, you could break the lines differently. That's sometimes something to suggest. You could look at it and think about that.
I mean, scene of the crime seems like something that might be expected. Maybe that could be rephrased.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a phrase we know, right? That's a good thing to point out. Yeah, that's a phrase we already know. All right. Just take a look down the right-hand column and see if there's anything else that you might be able to use. We talked about some of the sounds, the speaker, the tone, free verse, something about the subject.
Yeah, Bonnie says combines lines 1 and 2 or lines 2 and 3.
Yeah, this is a good suggestion.
Yeah. In my reading of it, line 3 and line 5 talking about the original and then the original something seems to be a little bit clunky. Maybe combine those ideas.
Yeah, And sometimes when you break a line with a dash, it's hard to get back to the next place in the sentence. So that looks like that stanza really could be worked on to be less clunky and a little cleaner, especially if it does turn out to be the last stanza. All right. This is just a little example of how we might look at some of these elements, work our way around the poem, consider in that experimental lab way, what's going on here, what can we observe about it, what might be done differently. Just get to know the poem in order to be able to make comments on it that might be helpful to the person who wrote the poem. And as I said, you can also do, if you're stuck on a poem and maybe you've let it sit for a little while, you can come back to it and use some of these things to get back into your own poem, but with a different perspective, with a little bit of distance. All right, I'm going to finish up with just a brief consideration, and I don't need to have the screen up. Does anybody still need that screen up? Just let me know. Okay. I think just about everybody has either been in a critique group or a workshop. Several of you have set them up. I just wanted to suggest a couple of things to consider. If you have been thinking about setting up a critique group and want some more specifics on how to do that. They're just the mechanics to start with. When and how often and where will you meet? Will you look at everybody's poem each time, or will you set up a schedule of alternating turns? Do people get the poems? Thanks, Michael. Do people get the poems ahead of time, or do you just bring them in for a blind read? People like to do that differently. Will you bring copies? Do you want to make it an interactive discussion with the person who wrote the poem, or will that poet just kind of sit quietly and listen to people talk about it and then have a discussion afterwards? So just think about the mechanics. What can you work out in terms of how you want to do this group? And then I think it's also really helpful to have a little discussion around your group ethos and your goals. Is it going to be a tough love critique group where, everybody wants you to just be as tough as you can? If you have a mixture of opinions about that, then that could create difficulty. So what do you want your ethos to be as a group? You obviously are doing this to get better, so there's going to be critical, in the sense of, one hopes, helpful comments about how to improve the poem, but how what's your tolerance for critique? And do you want an atmosphere of we're doing this to get published? How can you get this poem ready for publication? How can you get this poem ready for submitting to contests? I know of several groups in Alabama, critique groups, that have created their own anthology. You might be working towards that. It might be that you do not have the goal of publishing the poems, but you want to get together with a few people and read each other your work and talk about it and just try to make the best poems that you can and talk about poetry. So having some clarity about your ethos and goals is also very helpful. I did want to mention a comic novel that I read recently about a poetry critique group in England. It's called Diary of a Somebody. It's by a man, I don't think this is his actual name. He's called Brian Bilston, Bilston, and he's known as the Poet Laureate of Twitter. So I will just mention that book as something I got a big kick out of and really enjoyed reading, if you're interested in a comic take on a critique group. Okay. I think that we've, okay. Bonnie And depending on where you are, Bonnie, there might be some suggestions. Do you mind sharing your location? Okay. I believe that at least one person, I've heard recently of somebody setting up a group. Birmingham people? You have ideas of groups in Birmingham?
Birmingham might be able to have one set up, but what do you have up there in Gadsden, Rachel?
I have lots of people talking about it, but they haven't set up anything.
Okay, so yeah, I know
Yeah.
Gadsden's been bubbling a little bit with potential for literary things. So that might be worthwhile to kind of inquire at the library. So Springville's got their library. That might be a place to check out. I know there are several of us, doing poetry things at UAB. So if you just kind of contact me afterwards, I will see what I can do to get you connected with other poets in the area. Okay?
Yeah, I really like that library suggestion. That's often a good place to either look at the bulletin board or put up your own notice on the bulletin board. In Tuscaloosa, we have the Tuscaloosa Writers and Illustrators Group, TWIG, and they meet once a month at our public library, and super supportive group. I've been going a long time, so that's the one I know about locally.
Right.
Yeah.
We also have the online Facebook group, Birmingham Area Writers, and I mean we've got 600 members on there right now. So even if you were to put a call out to, hey, who wants to start a poetry critique group, that would be a wonderful way to sort of get that. And I've got another organizer on that Facebook page who likes to kind of set up groups and everything like that. I may talk to Kayla about getting together another critique group session. She did that for us at the beginning of the year. So we shall see. Oh, Rachel just dropped a group that started in Gadsden down in the comments. So yeah, so people are out there. We'll help connect you with some community.
Yeah, that's good. It's just helpful. Just find some other poets who are thinking about it. Yeah, and virtual can be that. I think we've all discovered now that you can have virtual groups. So good, Bonnie. Glad to hear that. Okay. Are there any questions about anything that I did not cover? You wanted more info about. Also, I'm going to throw my email into the chat here. If there's anything, whoops, didn't get the period in there. If there's anything you want to follow up on, feel free to shoot me an email.
All right, great. Any other questions, guys? Well, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Jennifer, thank you for showing up again and for being a wonderful poet laureate and representative for our state. We appreciate all of the work that you have done. You have been such a wonderful, representation of poetry and working in our state, and we just really appreciate you. So thanks to all of you again who came out and for showing an interest in Spark. And if you want to stay in contact, so you can find me, Haley Cotton, on Facebook. Be sure to join our Spark social media pages so that you can stay up to date with our future events. And if you're around, go ahead and join up with the Birmingham Area Writers Group as well, so that you can maintain community throughout the year. So thanks everyone for coming out, and y'all take care. I'll see all y'all later.
Thanks a lot, everybody. It was great to talk with you. Thank you.